Too late. No, if you need to interrupt me, that's perfectly fine too. We can always be flexible, right? No such thing as firm rules. Okay, so in Visual Studio then, File New, and before I go further, let me get my zoomer working. Before I go any further, I'll point out you've got a couple choices right off the bat. New project or new website. There's a subtle difference between the two. We could do either one, right? I might actually, for this very first one, I'll select a website, but let me talk about them before we go further. The basic difference is how it gets deployed later on, or how it gets updated, I should say, and maintained later on. If you do the website approach, right, it obviously is focused on just creating a website, but there's a difference in how it's compiled. I mentioned earlier that everything gets compiled on the server. When you create a website with ASP web forms, each page will actually get compiled into its own DLL, each single web form, right? The advantage of that is all the source code and the compiled version will be up on the server, on the web server eventually. You could actually just use like an FTP editing tool to go in, modify the code, say there was a little bit of a bug, you wanted to change the label on something or whatever, right? You could go in and edit the actual text file, the source file of the page on the web server, and at the next request that comes in for it, it would just recompile that one DLL for the one web page immediately because it would sense that the source code was changed, right? You can just upload a new version of one page at a time. And it's very, very easy then to maintain the site that way because it always just recompiles if there's been any change, and if there's no change, it just keeps using the DLL for the one page, right? A project is different. The project gets, the whole thing is compiled, no matter how many pages there are, into a single DLL that gets sent up and executed on the server, right? It gets a little bit more firm in some of the rules for namespaces and so on because it has to all live together in the one DLL. It has some advantages. One of the big advantages for many developers is the fact that you can actually just post the compiled DLL. You don't have to put your source code up on the server. Think about that for a second. If you are out there as a developer in your own business or whatever, you get hired by somebody just for a working website, but in your contract you keep control of the source code, so they have to keep coming back to you whenever they want to make a change or have it maintained. So you have a guaranteed money stream coming in for years to come. Then you can do it as a project. They get a fully working version of the website, but they don't have your source code, right? So that's one reason why a lot of people like to do it as a project instead. Plus the project has a few other little organizational advantages. The solution file is created right there inside the project folder and so on, so you can just pick it up and move it more easily from one computer to another, right? Little things like that. But the basic difference is how the pages get compiled separately in a website or the whole thing all together in a project. Other than that, they're basically the same, okay? But I'll start off with website because it has even fewer files in it to clutter up the screen at first. So we're going to make a new website. Come on, Visual Studio! I need my Jeopardy music to play whenever there's a long delay. Oh, there it is. Okay. Notice we have templates here for C# and Visual Basic, basically the same templates for both, just which language you like to use. So we're going to go with the empty website, but before I click OK, let me focus here. Look at this nice long path, right? C, users, administrator, documents, Visual Studio, websites, website, blah, 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 right? That's a big, long, ugly looking path, okay? And then I've had the experience in the past when you get a complex website or project with lots of directories and subdirectories and so on, you can actually run out of room for the number of characters. You start getting these error messages about the file path being too long. So whether it's a project especially or a website, what I like to do, I suggest this as good practice for all your development going forward. Make a directory in the root of the C drive, right? So if I come up here to my C drive, I can click this little button up here in this dialog box. You'll find it in different places, different dialog boxes, but create a new folder. And I'll just put my work here, whatever, right? And then inside that, is where Oh, okay, but because it's a website as opposed to a project, if I was doing a project, it would have a separate spot for putting a name for the project. Website, it would actually create it in this folder, which is not what I want. I want it underneath that folder. So I'll click Browse once more. I'll click a new folder there. So I'm going to call my site First ASP Example, or Demo. Okay. So you'll see that that actually becomes the name of my website, so to speak. Right? Now the name, in the end, when you deploy it, that name doesn't matter for anything, right? But it does help with some namespaces and so on temporarily. Okay, just before I go on, let me point out that at the top is a drop-down list of the version of the .NET framework we're targeting, right? No need to change it from the default, but notice it is something beyond 4.5, so we're going to have to worry about that unobtrusive JavaScript issue that I talked about, right? All right, that's it. I'm going to click OK and go for coffee. Have a sip. Put down my cup and go, there we go. And there it is done, right? Didn't take too long. There's just my web folder there. That's the kind of root folder of my website. And up here I see two files. Packages config, we'll talk about that later. Web config, that's the one I mentioned, has the configuration settings, right, for the website. By the way, I'd like to explain what I'm doing on the screen. To change font size, the little trick is if you press the control key, you can wheel the wheel button in the center of the mouse and make it big or small, right? I need reading glasses, so I tend to make things very big, okay? But it probably helps in the video anyway. It helps to see from the back of the room. So you notice that this is a XML file, right? Are you familiar with XML? Have you ever used it? Well, you may not know it, but you have, in the sense that HTML is a subset, right? All those rules about, lowercase attributes and, closing tags for opening tags and so on, all those rules in HTML, they come from the rules for XML, okay? XML is like a mother language, and there's a whole bunch of flavors of different languages that follow the same rules. Basically, it's great for things like configuration files because it's a way to describe anything, right? Any hierarchical structure of information can be described in an XML file. So it should look familiar. We have an opening and a closing configuration tag, right? System.web. Oh, here's some self-closing tags, right, with a little angle slash at the end before the closing angle bracket and so on. But we notice here that we're set to debug. We're set to a target framework of .NET 4.5.2 and so on. So later on, this is the area where we're going to add that extra little bit of code. But I'm going to leave it out for now so we can see why we need it, right? But just want to show you, this is about as simple a web form configuration file you'll ever see. Later on, when you get into the larger full templates and so on, there'll be dozens and dozens of lines of code in here. So this is the minimum you'll ever find in the configuration file. All right, but there's no actual web page here yet, okay? So I can right-click on the root ASP, first ASP demo folder here, and say Add. Say Add. And I can say add a new item. That'll give me a dialog box with hundreds of items to sift through and find. Or right down here I can find web form. Okay, remember a web page is called a web form using this tool, right? So I'll select a web form. It's suggesting the default name of default. Not sure if you're aware of this or not, but all web servers, whether they're Unix, Linux, Microsoft, or anything else, they have the same approach to the actual what the start file is. Like, you don't type a file name, right? You go to Microsoft.com or Google.com or whatever, right? And then it will find a page to show you. Well, all web servers are configurable in terms of the name of the page they're going to show by default. Usually there's a list, right? So it often starts off with like index HTML, index PHP, index this, that, the other thing. And if it runs out of all those options, then it'll often look for default HTML, default this, and so on and so forth all the way down through. Those are the two that most web servers are already configured to search for. So using the name default means later on any web server will immediately find this page as the default page and show it when you just ask for your website just by the domain address, right? Just like to explain why things are done sometimes as we go through. I know it's a little boring for those that know it, but please bear with me. Well, look at that. Ignoring that first line, this is all standard HTML5 stuff, right? Doc type, okay? Head, body, and so on and so forth. Look at that. We even have a form, okay? Here in this new blank web page. And notice it has run @ equals server in it already. We have to have that in the form tag for our web form page. Other than that, it's pretty well vanilla. The top line here is what we call the page directive. So it specifies certain things. Remember, this page will eventually be compiled into a DLL, right? Dynamic Link Library class. So some information here that the page language happens to be C#. Okay, some options here about how events are wired up and so on. There's a code file. Okay, the code file by default will have the same name as the web page file, the ASPX file, within the dot and whatever language. VB if it was Visual Basic, CS for C#. Right? Inherits. Ooh, sounds like what you're learning in object-oriented, right? You inherit classes. Well, this inherits _default. Well, let's have a look at this page. We can find it right over here. If we just look in the Solution Explorer, if I expand the little arrow beside default ASPX, there is that code behind file we talked about. Let me bring it up. Okay. Usings, right? This is a familiar looking C# class file. That's all it is, right? The name of the class is _default. Well, that's just what we said over here. This inherits _default. Okay. By the way, if you change the name sometimes, it doesn't always change in every place, so make sure whatever it says here inherits matches the name of the class in the code behind file if you manually are changing things, right? Notice that it itself inherits from System Web UI Page. So there's a page class in the .NET framework, so it inherits a whole bunch of capabilities, events, smarts, and so on right from that. Do you know what a partial class is? Have you talked about that in your C# course yet? No? All that really means is that it's saying this class is partially defined in this particular class file, this physical file stored on the hard drive, right? But it leaves the door open that we could, elsewhere in the project, continue working in that same class in a separate physical file. That's all it does, okay? In the end, it gets compiled into one class, but it gives us the ability to write a class in separate physical files. There's only one real reason why that's a nice feature. It declutters, right? So all the stuff that is in the earlier days before we had partial classes in a web form, you'd come in here and there'd be like 150 lines of code, boilerplate code with warnings all over and big stars around it saying, don't touch this code, right? Or you'll break the system, okay? Because that was part of the boilerplate stuff to make the page work, okay? But they had to include it to have it in the class. So somebody thought, you know what? Why don't we make partial classes so we can have separate files that still go together to define the one class? And that has cleaned up the screen tremendously. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in some other file that we don't need to worry about seeing because we aren't supposed to touch it anyway, right? With that 150 lines of code that we never need to see or think about, so why even have it on the screen cluttering things up, okay? Don't go there, okay? We don't want to touch that code anyway. But anyway, that's all a partial class is. Let you extend a class or write a class in separate class files and have it all combined together by the compiler in the end. Okay, so we have one page load event, right, defined. Remember, that's the beauty of this web form approach. It simulates an event-driven application. Is that a new term for anybody? Event-driven development? The idea is that instead of writing big long procedures that just execute when something opens or whatever, event-driven programming, that goes back decades, right, to when you would define programs that would execute specific chunks of code in response to events. That event could be somebody clicking on a button or selecting something out of a drop-down list, or even, of course, obviously a page load event, some code you want to execute whenever the page initially loads, right? So that's what event-driven programming is all about, and that's how all Windows applications are based on, right? Whether it's, you know, Microsoft Excel, there's an event when you enter a new formula in one cell or whatever, and it recalculates the whole spreadsheet, right? It all happens in response to events. Well, event-driven programming in a web page wasn't possible before this type of thing. Okay, so that's our page so far. Now, just before we go further and start working in this page, let me point out right down here at the bottom, there's a little choice we have. We can view the ASPX page itself 3 different ways. Right now we're looking at the source of the page. I can go to the design of the page, or I can split it between both and have them both on the screen at once. Now, let me just go to design for a second, right? Just zooming out. I'll bring up the toolbox and pin it down. Takes a little while to initialize it the first time. There we go. Oh, pin it down. So now we're into that WYSIWYG kind of situation where I can drag and drop controls. So if we look at the standard controls here, right? There's a whole bunch of them, as I said. There are data focused controls. Oh, there's our validation controls. We're going to play with some of them. Oh, look at that. Way down here is HTML. So these are standard HTML controls. So I could drag and drop this input type equals text. Just drop it inside this div, and there we go. But notice in the source, okay, there it is here, right? Input type equals text. So you can split the screen, and you can work in either one interactively, and you know, whatever changes you make in the design view show up in the code, and vice versa. And like I said, unlike many other tools, it doesn't overwrite code for you. It basically just does the minimum exactly what you had in mind. Okay, but you know, just to compare, I can press enter, and you see I got a BR tag up there in the source code as I pushed enter in the design view. But just to compare, that's a text box. If I come up here to the standard section and select a ASP, one of those smart server controls, the one I want is text box. I'll drag and drop it right underneath. Okay, so you see in the design they look identical, right? But in the code they look a little different. Input type equals text, ASP text box, right? IDs of course are used like identifiers. Okay, this has run on equals server, that one doesn't, but that's okay. And there's a closing tag here to go along with it, right? Okay, maybe I'll press enter once more and I will stick a button. Now this is an ASP button. Okay, run on equals server, ID is just button 1. By the way, the text of course is whatever appears on here. Click me. Okay, there we go. All right. Oh, it didn't refresh, but it will. So let's bring this up. Oh, I happen to have Chrome. Chrome's okay. I like Chrome. There's a bit of a time delay though because it wants to load and enable all this as client-side debugging. Oh, that silly thing. We'll get rid of that. Actually, that's kind of a useful tool. Browser Sync. It's a plug-in for Visual Studio. It's funny. I've been with students that have just clicked OK to this for 2 years and they never even knew what it was. It's a plugin for Visual Studio that allows you to have multiple browsers open and changes made in one immediately synchronized in the other. Right? Okay. So there's our web page, our 2 inputs. Okay. Let me just point out that if I type something, in each one, right? Oh well. If I click me, right? Of course, it's going to post. It's going to post back to itself, right? And of course, when it does, the response will just be to send it back again. The HTML element lost the data, right? Because I didn't write any special code on the server side to pull the data out and save it and put it back in. The ASP control automatically maintains state, right? You don't know how much of a yay that was when I first saw that, right? Compared to all the work we used to do to try and maintain data like that in a postback situation when it's a self-posting page. Okay, let's just look at the source code for a second. If I view page source here, okay, let me focus first on the actual div. So there's my input type type equals text. Wait a second, I don't see ASP text box. Of course not. As I said, it generates basic plain HTML to be sent down to the client. Even that ASP button, it's just input type equals submit, right? So all we get in the client is easy to work with, no special programming required HTML, right? But how does that maintain state then for this particular text box? Well, I mentioned there will be a hidden input. This one is called view state. And the value, see that big long value? That's an encrypted version of the data in the page. If you have a whole bunch of controls and a whole bunch more data, it just gets a little bigger, right? It's actually pretty efficient. It compresses it down fairly well, so it's not huge the amount of data that gets stored there, right? A couple of things is some more hidden inputs down here for view state, okay? So it helps keep track, all in this data stored in the page. What's the view state? What's the event validation? Who clicked on what? What button was last clicked, and so on and so forth. It tracks all that just by storing it in these hidden inputs. And that allows it to be event driven so that I can write something that happens in response to clicking this button, besides the submit action that it does by default, right? So if I were to give a meaningful name to my text box here instead of text box 1, okay, good practice is often considered, name things that you're going to refer to in code or in a property of another control. So I might call it txt, I'm drawing a blank. Can't think of a meaningful name here because it's just a simple demo. txt demo, how's that? Okay, that's the name for my text box. All right, just going to declutter here a little bit. I'm just going to go straight to the design view. Okay, if I double click the button, ooh, look at that. I'm in the code behind page. I never did name the button. Darn, sorry, I should have done that, but that's okay, it's a quick demo. So it's button 1 click. Let's notice if we do look at the source, how that changed something inside the source here of the page, right? Inside the button itself, remember it has run equals server, text. Well, look at that. On click equals button 1 click. That's how the system knows that this particular element of the page, okay, has an event corresponding to a chunk of code in the code behind page, right? So on click of this button, not only will it do the default submit, but when it gets to the server after it submits, it says, wait a second, we clicked that button. So any code that I put inside here, we should execute, right? So what can I do? I can go text demo. See, IntelliSense helps me. That's the name of my text input. Dot text equals. Remember, we're writing C# code here, right? So ASP.NET is fun. And I have to put a semicolon. Again, because I'm writing C#. Okay? All right. So if I come back here again, run this once more. When I click me, you will notice very briefly up, there'll be a little flicker in the tab showing that the page is refreshed from the browser. And there we go. So it executed my click event of the button and modified the text on the page, right? Maybe just to show you that we can actually manipulate HTML elements. Let me put up here an H1 tag. Notice that there's all kinds of help in this tool, even just writing basic HTML, right? As soon as I do that, I get a closing tag generated for me. Okay. Start here. But I'm going to give this an ID equals. It even puts the quotes for me and everything. Oh, I like tools that help me be lazy. ID equals the heading. And I'm going to put run at equals server. Even right there in the IntelliSense. Okay? So now the heading start here, I can manipulate that property, right? So if I come back to the, I just save that change, come back to the code behind. So in addition to putting that text in the text box, I can now go, what did I call it again? The heading. Well, there it is, right in IntelliSense. The heading dot, look at all this IntelliSense. I could play with things like inner text or inner HTML, right? So if I actually want to supply HTML to go inside there, I could, but text is enough for inside a heading. Inner text equals Dave was here. Feel free to use your own name, you know, personalize it, right? But of course, I'm writing C#, so I need a semicolon at the end of the line. Okay. And notice that you can choose any browser you want, right? Maybe I'll use Edge for a change. You might say, why would you use Edge? It's not a bad browser. I'll click me, and there we go. So we were able to change a basic HTML element, a header tag. We changed the inner text of that header as well as, okay, the text inside this ASP text box. So that should give you some feeling for the kind of power you have with this tool. Well, I have to press the stop button. So some browsers automatically stop Visual Studio running when you close the browser. For example, Internet Explorer does. Chrome seems to now because of that client-side debugging that's going on. But most don't. Okay. So what else could we do here? Well, let me just for simplicity, I'm going to declutter a little bit here. I'm going to get rid of the Control Z. Just that one input type equals text. I'm not really going to use it. But what I might do in design view, let's validate. Let's make sure something has been entered here, right? I can hit a space bar. That'll put a non-breaking space in. Let's come over to the toolbar. Here's the validation controls, right? So I'll just grab that required field validator. Okay. So this gives me a chance to talk about some controls we add. You see this little quick task helper, right? So that's on some of the controls, and then that usually gives you a menu of things that you can do. Now, not much on in this case, but just I mention it now. So quick things that are often changed appear right here in the quick task list. We'll see more options show up when we start getting things like radio button lists and drop-down lists and so on. Okay, but everything else you can usually change quite easily either in source code, but there's also the properties window. And the properties window often makes it easy because IntelliSense is good, but sometimes seeing them all laid out, organized, and so on helps you find the thing you want to change, right? So here's my required field validator. Should I change the name of this? Probably not. I'll never have to refer to it. It does everything for me automatically, right? What I probably want to change here is the error message, okay? So that if it's not filled in, I want to say something like, please fill in the box, right? Always good to have these friendly messages to the user to explain exactly what's wrong, right? Okay. Now, you notice that the text was just black. We can change that. By the way, I could do it a number of different ways. Look at, I even have a little color thing I could work with if I wanted to. I could be nice and lazy and just type red, right? Best approach probably is to actually use a CSS class, right? But I don't have any CSS classes yet. We will be adding some pretty soon. But for now, I'll just say red. By the way, I should mention the difference between error message and text. If I don't specify text, then the error message will actually appear right on the page where I put the control. If there's a text property specified instead, that's what appears there, right? So a common practice is just to put like a little star or something like that, okay? But don't worry, the error message isn't lost in that case. It's still there to be used in the validation summary when we get to adding that. But for now, I'll just leave the error message as it is. But the most important property to set we haven't touched yet, control to validate. So it's great to have a validation control on here, but what the heck box are we talking about? Well, look at that. I even have a list. Okay, so I only have one. But if I had a whole bunch of them, they'd all be in the list, and I could pick out the one that I'm associating to validate, right? And that's it. That's all I really need to do here. Now, if I run this once more, when I click me, I need my sad trombone sound. Wah, 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 wah. Oh no, I got an error message. Okay. You know, I don't know how many times I walk around the room, students are working, they get something like this up on the screen and they go, oh, panic, quick, get rid of that, quick. It scares me. No. You should look at this and say, oh, yay, I have a helpful error message. My friend, the error message. Look, it tells me something is wrong. Don't just click to get it off the screen. Read it, because it'll probably tell you what you have to do to fix it, right? WebForms unobtrusive validation mode requires script resource mapping for jQuery. Ah, there's that darn unobtrusive validation issue we talked about. Told you I'd leave it so I could show you the problem. So if you get this, okay, we could try to get a script source mapping for jQuery, or just put that little bit of code inside the web config file, right? So if I bring up my web config, I can go back to Blackboard, where Dave has put the code for me for easy reference right here in content by type. Right down at the bottom, look at that, fix for unobtrusive JavaScript error. Okay, I put it in a text file before I realized you can just copy and paste it right off the web page here. Okay, I'll just Control-C to copy, go back to Visual Studio. Now, just be a little bit careful. It has to be inside the configuration/configuration, but you don't want to put it inside any of the other sub areas, right? It doesn't belong in system.web, it's its own thing. So I'll just put it right here, app settings, okay? And there we're adding that key to tell it not to try and use unobtrusive validation mode, right? Save it, run it again, click me, and there we go. So now it's validating, right? Please fill in the box, kind sir, right? There it is. So, and notice that happened. We didn't post back yet. It's actually using client-side script to do that, right? It wrote some script for me. By the way, the script would be different if we were using unobtrusive JavaScript. Okay, so again, it's adjusting for the capabilities presented in the situation. If I type something in here, even just tabbing out, it still hasn't posted back, and the error message is gone because it's satisfied that required field validator. Now if I click the click me button, it will actually go back to the server and execute all the event handling code that I put inside the button, right? Wow. But what if, okay, not just that something is filled in, but we want to make sure perhaps that it's an integer that's entered there, or whatever, right, or a date or something, right? Okay, so if we do that, then when we come back to the page, well, what I could do is right beside this, I could stick another validator. Maybe I'll do the compare validator. We're just going to use it to check that it's a valid date entered, right? So again, I'll come over to the properties area here. Okay, I don't need to change the name because I'll never refer to it anywhere. Error message. Value must be a valid date. Okay. I'll maybe set it to red just so it matches the other. Now there's a few more options to set here. Remember, the compare validator is quite capable. It can compare two controls to each other. It can compare one control to a fixed value, right? And so on and so forth. So there's a control to compare. Well, that's not what we need. So I can leave that at blank. I don't need to set that. But I have to set the control to validate. And that can be the same input, okay, that I'm already validating with my required field validator. By the way, if I didn't have the required field validator on, this will just ignore. If it's left blank, it won't care, right? It won't do any validation if it's blank. It only jumps in and does its work if there is something there to validate. So I'll validate my TXT demo, right? Down here are a few more options. Remember, this is capable of doing comparisons and so on. So we can also set an operator. The operator could be, how does it compare? Is it equal, greater than or equal, less than, and so on and so forth? Okay, but for now I just want a data type check, right? Type, well, that's the next key thing. What data type am I looking for? If I set it to date, there we go. Now we'll guarantee it's a valid date, okay? By the way, there's the value. If you were going to compare it to a fixed value, right, then you could just enter the value in here. Maybe we should do that. Well, maybe we'll do that later. We'll do this a step at a time. So that's good. That's all we have to do here, I think, for now. So let me try it once more. We'll run. Okay. So I'll click B. We fill in the box dummy. I fill it in with garbage. Oh, okay. Value must be a valid date. So it's checked that. It says, okay, you met my required requirement, right? You filled in something, but now the compare validator is saying, well, that's not a valid date, right? Wouldn't it be better if I actually had something like 2018? I don't know. That's my lazy way to write dates. There we go, and now it's happy. Wait a second, why don't we have a nice calendar control here? Aren't good modern web browsers capable of that? Well, they need a bit of a hint though, right? Maybe just before we go on about validation, we can talk about that. So this text box, one of the properties we could set is right here, text mode. I could do it in the properties window, or if I went into the code, I could just start typing text mode, and then I'll get an IntelliSense list. So multi-line text, passwords, date, time, okay, and so on and so forth, email addresses and things like that, right? So I can just select date. And by making that one change here, by the way, this isn't a WebForm thing in particular. You can do the same thing with any HTML element, right? Ooh. Okay, remember I chose Edge, so it's using the standard Microsoft date picker thing here, right? So you pick the date you want, click the check mark for good, and then it fills in the date for you. Now it's going to be pretty hard now not to get a valid date in there. All right. Let's just, for fun, bring it up in Chrome instead. Okay, so it uses Chrome's date-time picker, right? So that's very browser dependent. It's just the browser is looking to see, oh, they're looking for a date for this input, and it will use its own particular style of calendar. Firefox has its own now. It used to be Firefox didn't have it, but now it does, and so on and so forth. All right. Fair enough, but I want to be able to validate. I don't want to have a valid date in there, so I'm going to go back in here and just take that out, right? That text mode equals date. Remember, this still is just a text file, so I can edit it directly in here as well. Okay. Just put that in for the fun of showing you the calendars. All right. So back in terms of validation then, we're almost wrapping up this demo. But you know, since we have a date on here, what if we want to say, well, you can't put a date in the past? Eh? Can't put a date in the past. How would we do that? Well, we did say on this compare validator that we can put in right down here value to compare, right? So if I put today's date, 2018, what is it, 07, what's today's date? 06, and change my operator from just a data type check. By the way, we'll always do the data type check, greater than or equal. So if I put in today's date or in the future, then that will be valid. Otherwise, it will be invalid, right? So I'll run it here again. So if I put in 2018, 04, must be a valid date. Okay. Two issues. One thing, I hate the fact that it's so far over to the right, as opposed to, you know, being right beside the text box. But also, you know, we're getting the full message there. We're going to see how we can change that a little bit. So today is 06, right? Oh. There we go. So that's valid. If I even go back to the 5th, that's invalid, right? Well, that's great for today. But if I run this website tomorrow, right, then that wouldn't work, would it? So I have to make that dynamic as well. Maybe I'll leave that for now. I'll let you think about that. We're going to go on. I'm going to fix this issue, the fact that this is way over to the right. If I come back to the required field validator, one of the properties here is display. Right now, display is static. That means it takes up room on the screen for the message, whether it's showing or not. So if I click the drop-down list here, I can change it to dynamic. By doing that, the display will only take up any room on the page if it has to actually show the message, right? Notice I'm doing that on the one to the left, the required field validator. So now I get the fill in the box, put in garbage, and now I'm getting the valid date message, right? And it's not shifted over to the right because the other one, because it's not trying to display, doesn't take up any room on the screen. That's a little tip for you. Okay, it's not a big deal usually, but it's kind of nice to be aware of that. You can change it to dynamic so it doesn't take up room unless it needs to show itself. All right. A little bit more about validation, then we'll wrap up this. One of the things I said is if we put often just that little star, the shift 8, right, the asterisk for the text properties, then instead of showing the error message, it'll just show that, right? There's good and bad there. Yay! So that's the required field validator. And now it's the compare validator. Doesn't really make it very clear, does it? What we really need is our summary, right? And that's going to solve that problem for us. So I could put it anywhere on the page. I'll just press enter here. I'll throw on a validation summary control. Double click it, and there it is. Maybe it would work without changing anything, but obviously I probably want to, at the very least, make the color match, make it red. And you know, something I pretty much always set, notice we have a choice here. We can do a bulleted list of all the issues on the page, a single paragraph, or a list, okay? But up a little further is the header text, or maybe it's down further. There we go, header text. Please fix the following, right? Okay, that's all I have to do. Now, okay, I'm only getting the star here, but the summary is listing all the errors on the page. Now there's only one error right now, right? But it's showing it. Now as I type something in, okay, now the other validator is showing here. The summary doesn't actually update unless we click the button, right? And when I click the button, now it's showing me the error message for the current state of the page, right? If there were 2 or 3, they would all be listed in bulleted form, one above the other, right? So I can see all the errors on the page listed together, okay? I only have the one input to worry about, so I'm only ever going to get one at a time in this case. Last thing to show you about the summary control is it has a couple of Boolean values that come in handy. There's show summary, true or false, show message box. I can set them both to true. To be really annoying, set them both to true, and then I get my message box, and I get it showing up on the page, right? So typically what we'd more often do is set one or the other rather than both. So I'm going to take off show summary, make that false, leave show message box true, and that way when I have an error, okay, I get the please fix the following, fill in the box. Okay, let me do that. Now the message says must be a valid date, right? And away we go. So that's our choices for that validation summary. So I think without showing you the answer to that code issue, but I'll give you a hint. So on break, you might want to try it yourself. Page load. Okay. Here's where I might want to actually give that darn compare validator a meaningful ID, because I do want to modify a property in code. I'll come right down to the bottom where ID is. You know, there's not one naming convention for these anymore, right? Some people just leave compare validator and replace one with something to indicate compare validator date, right? Whatever you want. Or they might use a 3-letter form, but there's so many different variations now, it's hard to come up with 3 letters that'll be unique for one thing at a time. Compare validator date. So I go back to the source code. Sorry, not the source. The code behind. Now, compare validator date should be in here. Dot. Remember what property it was we hard-coded our date in? Value to compare equals. Oh, the rest is easy. You can figure this out on break. Okay, how are you going to come up with a C# function to return to today's date? Remember though, this looks for a string, right? You can find that out by hovering over it's a string. So you have to work out an expression on the right-hand side here that would return today's date as a string. So try to do that on your own over break. Okay?